Our theme has been relationships over the last several weeks, and so a few weeks ago Howard asked me to speak today on relationship to the Word. So I said I can do that. And the last time I spoke was a couple of months ago when I spoke about the boys' home I lived in as a teenager and had photos of the aerial photos of how it had slowly been demolished and is now a great rambling housing estate. After that, I've had people who ask me more about what my life was doing back then. And so there's sort of two themes here. One is our relationship to the Word in this book that we recognise, but also just in relationship to the Word that God put inside my head. When I got to the age of 20, I needed a fix. And so there was a time, pardon me, there was a time when, as if the voice of God said, deep within, we can fix this if you want to. And so when I was 20, that was the sort of foundation of how I had to see my life. I'm going to speak of what led up to that, 4 parts of my life, one from age 4, 10, 14 and 20. Some of it is pretty traumatic, a lot of trauma and violence in my background. I'm aware that there might be people with similar things, and if you feel somewhat distressed, that's not my intention. I'm not going to speak too deeply on any particular thing, but if you need to withdraw to one of the rooms, we understand that. So there's 3 bits. I'm going to speak of the bad stuff first. Then I've got a video which will be which is an uplifting, inspirational kind of thing to get us back on track, and then the good stuff from 20 onwards and the way that God brought about that fix. So we go back to 4 years old. I was the youngest of 3 brothers and had a younger sister, so there's 4 of us, and mum, dad, 4 kids. And when I was 4, the family just disintegrated. Everybody disappeared and left me I was put in the care of a woman who was supposed to care for me, who turned out to be very violent. You can't tell a 4-year-old what's going on. All I had was this grief that everybody had disappeared and my life was now terrible. I sat with my eldest brother and we tried to talk through what was happening over, this is in adult life, and figured out that time lasted for going on 2 years. By the time it came to an end and I was rescued out of there, I was highly traumatised. I've only once, when I was in my 40s, managed to get my mother to speak about what was going on, something she was very reluctant to do, and she said that the family disintegrated because of domestic abuse. She ended up in hospital in Sydney for a long time, and we were in central New South Wales, out in a little country town, and then she sheltered with friends until she felt strong enough to come back and rebuild the family. She said I was totally traumatised, wouldn't let her touch me, wouldn't let her care for me, to bath me for about 6 months. So that was the 4-year-old thing. It left me with nightmares that were just so regular I could almost predict, really, through to my adult years. There are times when I tried not to go to sleep because I knew going to sleep was going to be worse than staying awake. Try and do that as a little kid. I also had flashbacks of this woman, and one of the images that appeared was of a little boy with hands around his neck and thumbs into his throat, and his face just trying to gasp for breath. I thought, these can't be real, these sort of memories. They just cannot be real. One of the things that happens to little kids in violence is we start to dissociate. And dissociation is where your brain turns off, your mind turns off one part from the rest of you as a protective mechanism so that you don't feel. So one part, like a little lifeguard in there, says, I'm just going to turn you off for a while, Kim, so you won't experience the whole trauma of this. And it's a blackout kind of freeze thing. Little kids can't fight back. There's fight, flight and freeze. Well, little kids can't fight back against that kind of thing, 4 years old. And so the freeze happens. So that dissociation happened on and off right through my life. In my adult years, I had to have a bunch of x-rays for a pinched nerve in my spine. There's a vertebrae out of line, so a bunch of x-rays, and I'm standing there with a physiotherapist who's going to sort of get this thing straightened out, and he started pointing at broken bones. And he said, look at this collarbone here. He said, see how it's bent? It's got this lump. And he said, I can tell the way that's sealed up. It was never set. Yeah, it was broken, and it was never treated, never set. And also, I can tell by the way the calcium is formed up around it, this happened a long time ago, and you were very young. And he said, did you know you've got a broken vertebrae? And I thought, well, no one knows that. And I said, no. He said, look here, and there's one vertebrae with this very definite crack through it. And he said, but this is the worst bit. He said, see here, this is your trachea, you know, your windpipe, the rough corrugated kind of part. And he said, see it here, this white colour? And I said, yeah. And he said, it shouldn't be white on the x-ray. Your trachea is made of soft tissue and bands of gristle. It should show up like most of the organs and the flesh of your body does in an x-ray, just as paler grey shadows, because the bones that show up white. This trachea is showing up white because it's been damaged, and the body tries to repair the damage by adding in calcium to strengthen it. So he said, I've never seen anything like this before. I've got no idea what kind of trauma has happened, that this is what your trachea looks like. Hang on. So I stood there, unable to tell him what happened. And that's where I'm going to leave year 4 years old. The family was always chaotic and dysfunctional. If there's ever two people who should not have hooked up and had kids, it was my parents. We go to 10 years old. We lived on a river, out in the Lachlan River. 10 years old, and my dad is going fishing and taking my next eldest brother, Pete. And I find out that they're preparing us. I want to go, and he said, no, I'm taking Pete, I'm not taking you. And I got a bit grizzly about it. And he said no, and we had this bit of an argument. And then Mum heard the noise from elsewhere and came in, what's happening? And I said, he's taking Peter fishing and won't take me. And Mum said, well, take him. He said, no, I'm not. I'm taking Peter. I'm not taking Kim. They had this argument across the top of my head. And then the sort of thunderclap in this storm above me. And he said, OK, then I'll take him, but I'm not coming back. So he sent me off to the car, and we got down the river, a bunch of people there, friends, and there's a, you know, this is back in the 1950s still. And circle of rocks and fire going, just getting some coals ready to cook some chops and sausages later on for tea. So Pete and I sat on the riverbank, just fishing, not saying anything, because that's what you do when you're fishing. And then the sun went down, and Dad got us in the car, drove us home, dropped us off. We walked in the front gate, and he turned around and went back to the river and never came home. So it dawned on me over the next days, weeks, months, that that was my fault, that I'd driven Dad off. Not even my father wants to live in the house with me, and I've done something which is just bad. Everything was bad. I somehow knew that this was my fault, and I just shouldn't have done it. Many years later, when my son was 10, we were living in Wagga at the time, and we were preparing to go on holidays, Christmas holidays, down the coast camping, down the beach. And Sam's happy about, you know, the prospect of that, and he comes bouncing in to say, Dad, when we go down to the beach for a holiday, can we go fishing? And it was like this steel band just wrapped itself around my chest, and it was a terrifying experience. So the answer to my son, of course, was, yeah, of course we can go fishing. And the answer to me was, you've got to get back with that counsellor. I'd been in touch with counsellors in the past, and I thought, this is just... this event just bang, still living within me somehow. Many years later, my sister, younger sister, said to me, I owe you a very belated apology, overdue apology. And I said, what about? And she said, well, when Dad left, I blamed you, and I kept on blaming you all the way through being a teenage and adult, and I was probably 35 years old before at last I acknowledged that you can't blame a kid for when the parents split up. So I just want to apologise, having bad thoughts about you for all those years. So it lives in her head too, you see. And only last year, up north, my brother, Pete, the fishing brother, lives up north in the same town, Coffs Harbour, where my son now lives. and we were up there for something, and we're just talking, a bit of a party, it was a birthday party. And Sam said something about fishing, and I said, you know me, I'm not the world's worst fisherman. And Pete, 70s, and he says, are you still blaming yourself for Dad leaving? Still in his head. So you see how these things carry on and carry on and carry on. So there am I in the middle of this 10-year-old sort of experience of driving my dad off, and things got chaotic. The lid was off my life, and it wasn't long before I was getting into juvenile crime, doing break-and-enters and stealing stuff. I won't go into that. Moved to 20. No, we moved to 14. I spoke about the boys' home. One thing that happened in the boys' home was that I got attacked in a sexual attack by a bunch of people, thrown to the ground, tearing my clothes off. I fought back, and then blacked out in dissociation. Just a total blackout, and then came to, I don't know how long I was out, less than a minute probably, and people were pulling on my arm, and I sort of looked, and I had one of the boys in a headlock, chokehold, and he'd passed out, and his skin was changing colour, and they got my arm off him, and he collapsed on the ground there, and they were frantic about this boy who was totally unresponsive. And I crawled back from there until I could stand up, we were sort of down on the ground wrestling, and I turned around and down the hill back to the boys' home. We're on a farm. There's several hundred acres where this farm was out west of Liverpool. And got into my room, and it was like I'd put myself down in a little submarine and pulled the hatch down and screwed the lid shut, and I stayed there in this semi-dissociated state for the next 3 or 4 years. So outwardly polite, calm, under control, but inside just this rage of emotional energy and the fear of the violence that I'd exercised against this other boy. What if that happened again and he didn't survive? It was years later when I was chaplain out at Bathurst Jail, and the CEO, national CEO of the Kairos ministry, we've spoken of Kairos, the team that goes into the jail and runs Christian programs, and we were just sitting there talking, waiting for someone else to come in to join this conversation, and I just happened to mention something about this boys' home, and he said, I was in a boys' home as a teenager in the 60s, and he said, what boys' home? And he said, where was that? And I said, I had Leppington, west of Liverpool. And he said, what, St Andrews boys' home? You were there? And I said, yeah. And he said, when? And I sort of early 60s. And he said, well, it was fairly new then. And I said, yeah, it was just a new place. And he said, I was on the board of management for that boys' home for several years, and we used to have members of the board would go out every few weeks and just to see how things are running and talk with the boys and see what's going on and stay for dinner. And he said, so Kim, he said, let me get my memory, there's not too many boys named Kim. And he thought for a bit and he said, I remember you. And he said, whenever we were out there, you were always in your room. And we had to send somebody for you, even for meals. Everyone would be there in the dining room and say, where's Kim? Oh, he's in his room. Okay, someone go and get Kim. And I thought, it's true. The things that I had in my memory was true, the things that was going on. Let's go to age 20. At the end of high school, I got a job as an engineering trainee at the Steelworks in Port Kembla, moved to Wollongong. 20 years old, the detectives came knocking at my door because I'd done some stuff, more things that needed detecting. And so, of course, I said it wasn't me when it was. But things weren't looking good for 20-year-old Kim. It was fortunate that I'd sort of, let's say, fallen among friends. And there's somebody who knew a solicitor who knew somebody else, and I found myself in a conversation with the guy who was the Director of Child Social Services in Wollongong. I was 20, but it sort of there were links back into my past. And so somewhere in the background, people were doing stuff. I have no idea what happened to those charges. Well, they never got to the point of charging. I have no idea what happened to that investigation. But it was only because people around me were working at things that I couldn't do, cared about me more than I cared about myself. There was a friend of mine, his name was Chris, was talking to him. He'd become a Christian not too long before, and he was just talking to me about his life. And as he was talking over time, I'm still friends with Chris, by the way. He and his wife Pamela, they stay at my place every year. They've got family in Canberra. They live in Queensland now, and they come through and stay overnight with me. And after all these years, and Chris was talking to me about his life under Jesus, and I was in the mess. It was like his train wreck. You know, the movie of the train, the old steam train going along the track, and then you see the bridge out, and the train down over the bridge, and that was where I was heading. And then this voice appeared in my head, this little quiet voice saying, we can fix this if you want to. And this was within the context of Chris talking to me about his life as a Christian. We can fix this if you want to. And I really need to get a fix for this stuff. So I gave my life to Jesus to fix. Jesus, the repair guy. I started going to a church that was close by. And someone said, they've got a good preacher. So I went in there and I learnt that I was a sinner, a rotten sinner, the worst of sinners. And I thought, well, I know that. And now I can't remember any particular sermon, but week after week, that's all I heard from this guy. So he had a relationship with the Word. And he would sort of like a scanner, and he'd scan across, and the Word would tell him these people are sinners. That's not a good relationship to have with the Word, my friends, because all it did was confirm in me everything I did in my life was my fault, it was bad, it was wrong. I deserved everything. I deserved the violence as a 4-year-old, because why not? I deserved everything because it was me that sent my dad away. I deserved it because the violence that nearly killed that boy in the boys' home, everything that happened was my fault. And this preacher just confirmed. He probably went on beyond that and started talking about Jesus' salvation, who knows. But I wasn't there to receive what he was saying. All I heard from this guy was, this book says that you're a dirty, rotten sinner. This is exhausting talking about this stuff. We're going to break. You're not going to break, I'm going to break. We've got a little video to put on, which Joan will put on. I'll tell you a little bit about it. 2 men. You might never have heard of the name Jacob Collier. Joan has. I gave her this video and she said, that's Jacob Collier. I said, do you know him? The only person, I said, you're the only person in this room who's going to know. Jacob Collier is the guy who starts singing this song. He's the most extraordinary musician. The song is by the band Coldplay. Heard of Coldplay? A few nods. And Chris Martin is the singer of Coldplay. So Jacob singing the song. Chris walks in. The whole audience goes wild. They swap. And then Jacob Collier does something magical. And be inspired. You're really in for a treat. I can probably just move this and leave that table there. Can you guys see past the table to the video? Okay, thanks, Joan. Tears come streaming down your face when you lose something that you can't replace. When you love someone and it goes away. Oh, could it be worse? Sing it. Lights will guide you and your well, high up above or down below. When you were too in love to let it show. But if you never try, you'll never know.
just what you were. Stick to our chords. Or in the chorus.
Wait a second. Let's go. Sing.
Lights will guide you on and ignite your bones. I will try to fix you.
Ready?
Tears stream down your face when you lose something you cannot replace. Tears stream down your face and tears stream down your face. I promise you I will learn from my mistake. Tears stream down your face and lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you. I will try to fix you.
If ever there was a song I needed to hear when I was 20, tears stream down your face when you lose something you cannot replace. So at 4 years old, I lost my family. At 10, I lost my dad. At 14, my self-respect, and at 20, it looked like I was going to lose my freedom. And the preacher told me that I was a dirty, rotten sinner. But I had the Word of God that I had to relate to that said, we can fix this if you want to. My friend Chris, who'd been talking about being a Christian for a while, he gave me a little packet of memory verse cards put out by a group called the Navigators, which some people might have heard of, but they're a bit obscure. 20-odd little memory cards that I'd memorised, and he taught me and he coached me to learning good quality Bible verses off by heart that gave me a future. Like how I'd read this morning, I have plans for your future that are hope. And my relationship to the Word started to get a bit deeper because of that. I needed a different church. And I met a guy who was the priest at the local Anglican church in a suburb called Fairy Meadow. The church was a rip-roaring charismatic powerhouse that people called Fiery Meadow. Charles Widdowson was the guy's name. And Charles was a power preacher, and he taught me a different view of what my life could be. He taught me that God wanted to put gifts of grace in my life that would elevate me rather than depress me. I learned from that community love for each other, and I saw people's lives change, and my life started to change. There was a fellow in that church, just one of the normal members, and he preached sometimes. His name was Ken, and he would hold his Bible under his arm, and he'd say, I remember, you're a sermon in shoes. He was about this high. And bigger on the inside. You're a sermon in shoes. He said, you might be the only sermon that people ever read. So when you put your shoes on in the morning, walk like you're preaching the love of God to people. And I still remember Ken there. You're a sermon in shoes. I thought, what a great... You don't need to hear the rest of the sermon after you've heard that bit. Ken took me under his wing, and he said, you need to start doing some decent formal Bible study out of a theological college. And he set me up with what's called the Sydney Preliminary Theological Certificate. It came out of Moore College, which is a big Anglican ministry training college in Sydney. And every 3 months we go through a new thing. There was a new subject, and we do exams, formal exams. I'd sit at his dining table and say, you've got 1.5 hours, and I'd write it out. And he'd send it off, and then we'd get the things back, and each 3 months a little certificate would return. New Testament 1 and New Testament 2 and Theology 1 and Old Testament 1, and we just went through a whole range of stuff over years. And he was just that kind of mentor that saw something to say this guy needs to put a bit of effort into how he's going about relating to the Word of God. There were 2 other people who mentored me named Bob and Rosie, married couple, probably 10 years my senior, couple of little kids, who took me into their family. They even had me in their spare room after a big motorcycle accident had left me in and out of hospital. I had massive head injuries and a leg that needed surgery and stuff. And so they just had me there living in their home. That was a hard thing for them to do. And Bob's not in the picture anymore, but Rosie's still going on as an old lady down at Wollongong. And I called in a little while ago, just touring through, and we were just talking. Said, I'm coming through town. I thought we'd get together and say hello. And so we were just sitting through the afternoon talking about old times. No, I've missed a thing here. Let me go back. I'll come back to that a little bit. Bob and Rose had a weekly Bible study that I used to attend, and I'd go around other times as well. One time I dropped in. Rosie said, I'm glad you're here. She said, come in and sit down, I'll put the kettle on. And she sat me down in the lounge and put the kettle on. She came back with a cup of tea, and she said, there's a lot of stuff that you need to fix in your life because you're highly offensive to Bob and to me and to our family and our friends and other people. and it's time you addressed it. And she pulled up a bit of paper that was about as cram-packed with my faults as this is. I mean, I look back, it is such a funny event. And she went through, and I said, yeah, I did that, I did say that, I'm sorry. And I'd known Rosie, Bob and Rosie, for a couple of years at that point, and I knew they cared about me. And I knew they loved me as a friend, as a brother, as someone who they wanted to keep contact with. Otherwise, I just would have got up and walked out. But part of the fixing of Kim was the preparedness to look squarely at my own life. And Rosie decided, it's time you did this. And I sat there. We must have sat there for over an hour as she went through this and talked about it. And I just apologised and apologised and apologised. And like in the song that Chris Martin was singing, I promised that I would try to learn from my mistakes. And that song hits at so many levels. And I got through that. I got through having the thumb screws applied that afternoon. And now we go back. Not too long ago, I'm going down through Wollongong and I catch up with Rose and we sit talking through the afternoon. And she just made this comment, when Bob and I took you on as a bit of a project, and I said, hang on. And I said, what did you say? And she said, when Bob and I took you on as a bit of a project, and I said, what the heck does that mean? And she just looked at me and she said, when we first met, your life was a disaster. And you were heading towards a cliff without knowing it, and you were going to go over the edge. But we could see that you had potential. So we wanted to help. But we knew it was going to take a lot of effort because you were a mess. This is the train wreck of Kim's 20s. Early 20s. So we talked it through. And we talked it through saying, what will it cost us to be friends with Kim and bring him into our life? And what will be the benefit? So way back then, we decided you were worth it. And we were right, because you've done a lot of stuff since then which would not have happened. And I thought, well, so I'm just somebody's bit of a project. What a godsend. What a blessing. That's what it means when Jesus said, we can fix this if you want to. The we wasn't just him and me. It was other people. It was a bit like Jacob was doing there with that crowd of 20,000 people. That's Christmas time last year, that concert came out of London. 20,000 people in the O2 Arena, the big sort of funny-looking building, like an arena halfway between a spaceship and a giant spider. And so he's just bringing all these different people into my life who somehow coordinated to do the we. We can fix this if you want to. I walked into the Bible study one night at Bob and Rosie's, and across the room there was this beautiful young woman who I'd not met before, and the first thing that went through my head was, wow, I fancy being married to her. Now, I did not in those days, and I still don't, go walking up and down the street looking at every woman and thinking, oh, I fancy being married to her. That just wasn't, no one does that. But that was straight away. Now, I was such a prickly kind of customer all the way through this fixing time. Every friendship was in danger. It was like trying to make friends with an echidna. Those things are spiky. They're self-protective, and people got too close, I'd be sarcastic or I'd be self-protective somehow. People, what a jerk that guy is, and that was the end of that. And so it was quite a dangerous thing for me to think of being married to somebody. However, I asked her out, and she had our first date. I'll tell you what happened on our first date. I picked her up. We went to the movies. It was the latest James Bond movie. How's that for romantic? But they didn't have a romantic movie on. So we watched James Bond. I was driving her home, and ran out of petrol. Oh, yeah. It sounds like a B-grade movie, doesn't it? But it was just because I had so neglectful of everything, I'd forgotten to fill the car. Well, anyway, Kay in that moment proved totally on top of everything and a no-nonsense person, and she just said, well, it's not far to my place, there's mower fuel in the back shed, we'll go down and get that. And so we walked out of Kay's place, and we got the can of mower fuel, we filled the car and then drove down to the servo to fill it up, and I dropped her home, and that was the end of our first date. And that, my friends, is true romance. A few months, we survived that. A few months later, we got engaged. And a few months after that, we got married. And we had a long and happy marriage. And until Kay lost her fight against breast cancer, some of you will remember that, about 10 years ago, we just coming up to our 39th wedding anniversary. But it might not have happened if it wasn't for what God was doing in my life. Well, it wouldn't have happened if it was not what God was doing in my life, but also what God was preventing from happening. Because here's a few funny things that happened before then. Now, first year of marriage, went on a touring holiday with family to introduce each other to other family members. One night we stopped in Wagga. My old flatmate from the knocking on the door of the detectives time, Brian, he'd moved to Wagga. He was another engineering trainee from the steelworks, and he was down there looking after the local TV station, electronics guy. And so we were down in Wagga and got in touch and said, oh, come round for dinner. So I went in for dinner, and he and his wife met us at the door, and Kay said, oh, hello, Brian. I didn't know you were an old friend of Kim's. And I thought, hang on, what is this? and it turned out that Brian in those days had a girlfriend who used to be at our flat fairly often, but Brian was at her flat fairly often, and guess whose flatmate to Brian's girlfriend was Kay. So Kay had met Brian a whole heap, and I'd met his girlfriend, Kay's flatmate, but Kay and I had never met. And so we're talking over dinner, and they said, oh, you could have met 5 years earlier. And I thought, no. That would have been the worst time. For me, this is the woman who knows how to fix how to get mower fuel into when you run out on your first date. One of the tasks I set myself as a young adult, because the trauma that I'd lived through as an adult had left me frightened of everything and of people. I was the skinny, scrawny kid that had always been picked on at school. So as a young adult, I had to face down my fears, and I just knew I've got to do something. And so I joined a rock climbing group with a few other young men. So each month, up around Katoomba, we'd be tied in groups of 3 and climbing, several hundred feet up rock walls. And in those days, you could climb the 3 Sisters. You can't do that anymore, but we'd sort of climb up the 3 Sisters and come walking over the top, and all these tourists, and we'd be there with ropes and all the climbing gear, big noting ourselves. And but then one day, someone had the bright idea, let's all go skydiving. Now, I just want to let you know that if anything in life that humans do not need to do, it is jump out of a perfectly good aeroplane. But if you want to face your fears, there are very few other things which will do it like skydiving. So before Kay and I were married, she spent 18 months touring the world with an old school friend of hers. So she and Tricia had grown up together, known each other through school. They'd saved like fury, and then they'd taken off, spent 18 months travelling around the world. And so after we were married, and Kay took slides everywhere. She had boxes of them. I've still got at home. And so each week we'd have slide night. Bottle of red, and fill a couple of things of the slide projector. I'm the only person I know who's still got a slide projector and a screen. And so she just slowly took me around this journey she had. One time she's in Austria, she'd learned to ski there, and this slide came up with a group of friends, and I said, that's Brian. Not the same Brian. That's Brian. And she said, do you know Brian? And I said, yeah. She said, that's Brian, that's Tricia's brother. And I said, well, Brian was one of my rock climbing friends and skydiving. And Kay said, yeah, well, he was in Austria. He went to skydiving with a group of friends and spent a weekend skiing with us. And this is someone who she'd known all her life. And so I'd known Brian for years and never met his family and never met his sister's best friend, that was just as well. We were walking down the street one time and this MGB came past, and of course every kid in the 1960s wanted to have an MGB, and I said, oh, look, I would have loved that. And Kay said, I've got a friend with an MGB. Not only that, but he's got his initials on the number plate, which is MG. And I said, yeah, that's Malcolm Graham. I know Malcolm. She said, how do you know Malcolm? And I said, well, I used to go to this young adult group, youth group thing, not youth group, young adult group, up in Fig Tree, and we used to always be doing scavenger hunts. So everyone would group into cars, and you get a list of the things. You've got to, get a traffic cone or a policeman's hat or something like that, get a list of 10 or 20 things. And she said, well, I was part of that. And I said, really? And she said, yeah. And I said, why didn't we meet then? I said, did you have a car? And she said, yeah, I had a car. Well, that's why we didn't meet, because I had a car. And the car people used to take the non-car people, so we never needed a lift from anybody. But she started talking about people who were in that group, so we knew a whole lot of people, but somehow I'd never met in that youth group. And I thought, well, that was just as well, because that was when I was being really toxic as a person. There's no way that Kay and I would have got on. The worst thing that happened in amongst all of that, maybe the best thing I missed out on happening, was we were talking one time back at the Steelworks. Kay started at the Steelworks the same year I did, 1968. We're down there, and she was a metallurgy trainee. And we were just talking about different places in the steelworks that we'd worked, because they moved their trainees around different departments a fair bit. And she said, I was in this department, one of the labs one time, research labs, with a guy named Kerry Withers. And I said, I know Kerry Withers. She said, well, not a really usual name. I said, yeah, Kerry was one of my flatmates. And she said, Kerry was? And I said, yeah, Kerry used to be in the Coke research lab. And she said, well, that's where I was. That's where I was working. And her mouth dropped, and she said, were you that Kim? This is dangerous. Were you that Kim? And I said, what do you mean? Well, there was 3 of you in the flat, wasn't there? And I said, yeah, there was Kerry and me and another guy whose name isn't Brian, Bruce. Bruce. And she said, Kerry used to talk about a guy who was in the flat, one of his flatmates named Kim, and I've got to read the note here. She said, who used to speak about a flatmate named Kim, but everything he said made you out to be horrible. That was just, well, we didn't meet in the days I was sharing the flat with Kerry. So all these times, in this early years of our marriage, of finding these places when we could have met, and somehow God said, not yet, not yet, not yet, because there was a fix-it job happening. And now we go back to the video. God was bringing people in and somehow harmonising people who didn't know they were being harmonised with God's goal in mind. So as my friend Chris, you know what the name Christopher means? Christ carrier. Yeah, we get the word ferry from the fur in the Christopher. It's a Greek word for carrying. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Here's Christopher carrying Christ into my life. And so God says, I need a guy like Chris. And he says, I need a church, not like the church that relates to the world through, relates to the Bible in a way that shows everybody how sinful they are, but a church that shows everybody, relates to the Bible in a way that shows what the possibilities of life are and how God wants to work in people and change the world. I need someone in Kim's life like Ken who will inspire him so that in 50 years' time he will remember parts of his sermon and remember to live it out being a sermon in shoes. We need someone like Bob and Rosie who will teach Kim what it means to be part of a family, to be included, to include others, but to face the stuff you've done wrong and learn from it and get through the rough patches and remain friends over all that. So let's go back to Jacob Collier in the video. 20,000 people in that arena. No one knew what they were capable of when he stood up and said, "Are you ready?" and started bringing them in. But this is what he does. Most extraordinary musician. His mum is the conductor of a symphony orchestra in England, and his grandfather is a member of a symphony orchestra in England. He grew up around classical music. He says, "My sister and I, we grew up singing Bach's motets." Well, everybody does that when they're kids, don't they? No. I've seen his mum in action in videos, conducting an orchestra. She is a firecracker. She's just wonderful. And so here's Jacob, and he gets in front of those 20,000 people and he says, "Oh, I can't do it, can I?" And then, "Oh." And so it's like God says, "Chris, give me a bunch of this stuff. And Ken, give me a bunch of this stuff. And Bob and Rose, give me a bunch of this stuff. Turn this up, bring that down, make them all swell together." So, Bible verse Chris is one note. And that second church I was in is another note. And Ken, with his preaching and the Bible certificate course, is another note. And Bob and Rose, who took this guy on as a bit of a project, is another note. That's the we in "we can fix this if you want to." So that verse has been in, that little word from God has been in my head for all these years. The written word he put in my heart to relate to in a way so I see the world in a positive kind of fashion. I see the world, see people as possibilities for the place of God's grace. Jesus didn't wall anybody else off from himself. He didn't have to go around telling people, "You're not in the group I'm in, you need to get into here." That wasn't his thing. And I related to that phrase, that little promise from God in a way, "We can fix this if you want to know that God's part of the we, but so am I. So I've got to be doing the work." And now, ever since I've seen this video, and I thought, a little imaginary thing. What if there was an angel says to Jesus, "Do you think Kim has been fixed enough that we can introduce him to Kay?" And he gives that jump like Jacob did at the end. That's the end of the story.